My name is Michael Goldberg, and I'm our executive director for the Veale Institute for Entrepreneurship at Case Western Reserve University, and I'm also an associate professor at the Weatherhead School of Management. And we're thrilled to welcome Mike Lubin today to our CWRU Entrepreneurship Alumni Speaker Series, mouthful. We were put in touch by our friend Brian Sokol, who's here today, and are thrilled that we were able to figure out a time to have Mike share his career journey and things that are happening in the current world of managing in COVID-19. Emma Risley, who is a senior student, and we were just chatting, for those who were joining, about her experience this summer interning for a local entrepreneur here in Cleveland. And so Emma's been a great source of energy on campus and doing great things. And in our remote time, it looks like you're from the home office, not on campus at the moment. So, but thank you for doing this. And for those that are both here on Zoom and watching on LinkedIn Live, if you have any questions, just let Emma know in the chat that you'd want to ask, be part of the conversation, and she can call on you directly. And if you're on LinkedIn Live, just put your question in the comment form, and Doug and I will be monitoring, and we'll get that. So with that, let me turn it over to Emma.
Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction, Professor Goldberg. So like I said, I'm Emma Risley, and I'm honored to be moderating today. As you may have seen, if you decided to join us late, or if you were registering, Michael Lubin is obviously a very accomplished man and has a great bio that was presented to everyone. But I wrote a little bit of one of my own, and I would like to share it before we kind of get into the nitty-gritty of everything. So just so you all know, for the past 16 years, Michael Lubin has worked as the Vice President of Corporate Development at ViaSat, which is a global communications company looking to connect consumers, businesses, governments, and militaries. In a technologically evolving world reliant on fast communications, Mr. Lubin has continuously studied this evolution and is aware of the necessity of a connected world. He has traveled to over 50 countries, started businesses, and has developed relationships with prominent international organizations such as the United Nations, through which he was invited to the Vatican to speak on issues of connectivity as a human right. So today, Mr. Lubin will be using his vast knowledge and experience to discuss his career and his ideas on the future of this specific industry. So thank you so much, Mr. Lubin, for joining us today and being here.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me.
Of course. Just so we can kind of start off, give everyone kind of an overview of your career path. You told me you didn't necessarily have a usual trajectory in your career path. So how did you end up in this current position that you've been in for 16 years? You know, what failures or successes have brought you to this moment in time?
Speaking about trajectories is always sort of interesting because you have to figure out where to begin from. So I think I was very fortunate that I had a very good piano teacher at the Cleveland Institute of Music who advised me in 11th grade that I was quite good in mathematics and should certainly not consider a career in music. And so, you know, with that advice, I actually started seriously thinking about something in math or physics or the physical sciences. And that brought me to Case because I grew up in Cleveland. Afterwards, I had intended to really pursue an academic career, getting a master's and doctorate in physics and hopefully teaching. But one of those life-changing moments happened at a bar at the Yale Club back in the early 70s, when an individual was criticizing me for my dress at that bar. And after about an hour of conversation, he offered me the job of becoming academic dean of a junior college in Massachusetts. And that really changed my life quite a bit. And I went into academic administration and did that for 4 or 5 years. And then another event happened where I wound up moving to San Diego without a job, and was talking to the vice chancellor of UCSD, Paul Saltman, and said, you know, is this a good time to be getting into academia? And he said this was a very bad time to be getting into academia, but I should go down the road and talk to this former IT professor, Erwin Jacob, about possibly working at his company called Linkabit. And I asked what Linkabit did, and he said it did satellite communications. And at that time, I wasn't sure if satellite had 2 T's and 1 L or 1 T and 2 L's. But I decided to go and talk to Erwin. And if any of you are electrical engineers or computer scientists, You may still be studying from Irwin's textbook on information theory, Jacobs and Rosencroft. And Irwin had started a company that was doing advanced signal processing for modems and coding. And I talked with him, and he said, "Yeah, you're hired." And I actually started out as his director of administration, running security and human resources and all kinds of things. But then a couple of years later, he asked me to look at the future potential of satellite communications for connecting locations that had no option of connectivity. And over a Christmas in 1980, two of us wrote a proposal that launched an industry called Ku-band ViaSats. These were very small aperture terminals that could connect people anywhere there was a Ku-band satellite. And our first customer was Schlumberger, and we went around to 50 countries with Schlumberger to see if we could connect their oil production and oil research sites around the world. And that really got me into this whole connectivity space. In 1985, Irwin left the company and formed a company that you're probably all familiar with called Qualcomm. And Qualcomm has been a great success story, of course, in connectivity, in cellular in particular. In 1986, some people left that original company and formed ViaSat, which is the company I'm currently with. And then in 1987, I went off with 4 people and formed a company called Pacific Communication Sciences, which actually developed what many think was the first smartphone. And this is actually it. This is from 1993. It was reasonably small. Believe it or not, this was the largest LCD display that could actually be produced in 1993. But if you look very closely, you'll see it actually has an @ key. And it was the first cell phone that ever had an IP address. And in talking about successes and failures, I think the great success was working with amazing technologists back then who realized the future of smartphones. We actually had voice commands in 1993 in that phone. You could actually do stock quotes. It was quite exciting, actually. But when you talk about failures, one of the things that we all missed back in the 90s was that smartphones would actually be media devices. And although we had put GPS in those devices for location services, we completely missed the whole media aspect to smartphones. We forgot about putting a camera in. And that was left to smarter people and people who really commercialized it, made it great, like the Apples of the world. But in fact, in 1995 or 1996, I hired a case graduate to come and work on this smartphone, Ram Fish. And ironically, after 25 years now, ViaSat has invested in his telemedicine company, and I'll talk a little bit about that later. Talking about successes and failures, I think that there are 2 issues of failure that I've had happen in my life that I think are good lessons. One was having the perception greater than it was of my own self-worth. And some of that was being young. This happened when I was 39. And it was when I could have become a founder of a company that now has a $125 billion market cap. And I actually made it about me versus someone else that was being chosen, and I lost. And it was pure ego. If I had just kept my mouth shut, I probably would have had a different trajectory at that point. But because of that failing, I did go off and start a company that we sold years later and was quite a successful company. The other failure was I decided to start a company in internet music because of the passion for music. And we were one of the hottest things going in the year 2000, and we're out raising money with a very good small investment bank in New York. And a much larger investment bank came to us and said, "You guys are so hot that we can go out and we can raise a lot more money for you, much higher valuation." And so this is the greed issue. I decided to change investment banks because of that. And in the intervening 3 months, when we had to redevelop the private placement memorandum, the stock market crashed. And we were unable to raise money, and we had to shut the company down. And so one of the lessons I learned from that is you can't really predict the supposed once in a blue moon kind of things that can happen, but they do happen. And there's an adage on Wall Street that if people offer you money take it. Don't try to over-optimize because things can happen in the intervening period. And that's happened to a lot of companies, unfortunately, in this COVID era. People who were trying to optimize because they thought the market was going to continue up, and suddenly in March, the market crashes because of a once-in-a-century event. So I think one has to think about ego as an entrepreneur and suppressing it if you can. And the other is about not being too greedy, because those things can lead to failures. Luckily, if you're an entrepreneur, you have to be able to live with failure. I think it's one of the attributes you need to be an entrepreneur is risk-taking and being able to live with failure. I was able to pick myself up and basically joined ViaSat and have had 16 wonderful years. And now the company has nothing less as a mission than connecting all the 3.5 billion people in the world who aren't connected. There are a lot of other companies that now realize that that's a worthy mission, like Elon Musk's SpaceX and Amazon and others. But I think we have an edge in that area right now, and it's going to be quite exciting. So I'm sorry for the long-winded trajectory answer.
I have such a broad question, and obviously you answered it wonderfully. And it's a great pivot point. You're talking about, you've obviously had a long career in this industry, both, internet music, but we're also talking about the first smartphone. You've obviously had experience with the world needing connectivity, and it needs it now more than ever. So I guess in your opinion, and while you've been working with ViaSat, how have you seen the necessity of connectivity and networking, I guess, beside right now in the COVID era, shift during this time, these decades that you've been working? What has been the main change that now we've decided that this is something that everyone needs, not just something that everyone wants?
No, it's a good observation, and it was the motivation for the conference in the Vatican as to whether connectivity has become so critical to existence in many dimensions that perhaps it should be declared a human right. And as I think I mentioned to you before, I think speaking in the Vatican and living in the Vatican for 3 days in the same building that Pope Francis lives in was one of the highlights of my life. And sort of intimidating when you're speaking in a building whose first president was Galileo. But this issue is that connectivity has become so critical to our everyday existence that there is a question about whether it should be a human right. And there are 3.5 billion people who still are not connected. And it turns out that a lot of those people actually have cell phones, and they actually pay cellular rates. But it's turned out that connectivity for internet access for data has just become unaffordable for many of these people. And what I think the challenge is for us as technologists and business people is to create technologies that can meet this affordability obstacle. And that's what's keeping us, a lot of us, from retiring, because I think we're at that threshold where we can finally do that. We knew what metrics needed to be achieved to make connectivity affordable for everyone, but it's only been within the last couple of years that we've been able to implement that.
I was going to say that connects a lot with your work with the United Nations. I know that in ViaSat, in their mission statement, believes everyone and everything in the world can be connected. So in theory, the UN has it that by 2030, everything can be connected, but ViaSat put their number at 2025. So what, I guess, gives you the confidence that you can reach out to these underprivileged areas and make this commodity affordable for everyone in the world, basically?
I think our confidence is based on the fact that we've started to do it. One of the things that entrepreneurs need to do is sort of pilots to test hypotheses. And as the CEO of ViaSat said a long time ago, because you can never predict timing from a business perspective, when people would adopt things. I mean, I thought in 1993 everybody would have a smartphone, but it really wasn't until 15 or 20 years later that actually happened. Because timing can't be predicted as well as trends that can be actually predicted. You need to invest wisely so that you don't run out of money too early, or you're undercapitalized. And one thing you can do is build confidence in yourself on a hypothesis and also convince investors by doing pilots or phased rollouts. And so what we did about 3 years ago is we went into the lowest socioeconomic communities that were not connected in Mexico, and we put them online. We started with 65 communities and then actually grew that to 3,000 communities involving 2 million people, and we connected them, and they started connecting, paying 50 cents, $1 per month. Now, they weren't watching Netflix, but they were actually doing FaceTime calls. They were doing interactive things with databases that were critical to their living. Some of the kids were doing homework, which doesn't require lots of gigabytes per month. And we realized that we really could transform people's lives by giving them enough connectivity that they could afford for single-digit per month dollars. And that gave us confidence to expand. And we expanded into Brazil, and we now are covering 15,000 schools, and we'll extend those into the communities. And we've changed our mission statement. We now believe we can do that anywhere in the world, affordably and reliably. And we believe that the demand is there. And if the demand is there, it will become a sustainable business. There was a study that the International Telecommunications Union of the UN just published that to connect 90% of the 3.5 billion people who are not connected would require about $440 billion. And then the question was, is that an obstacle or an opportunity? I just recently wrote a paper saying that we could do all of that by satellite for an order of a magnitude less. So I think the opportunity is there, and I think the investment potential is there. And I think that's why not only ViaSat, but Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos and others who were not incumbents in the communication space have decided to come into this space. And I think that's quite exciting, actually.
And obviously, with your experience, you've been able to build this interest and this knowledge, and knowing that satellite could be the future or something to mitigate the cost. But we actually I want to pivot back talking about your history to a question from Elizabeth on LinkedIn, which is, you mentioned your ego as one of your first failures. That's what caused it. Could you elaborate on that situation? Did you personally know the other person who was ultimately selected, or was it a personal incompatibility with the other person and his statement to the hiring position towards the other person? What would you say to that?
I did know the other person. In fact, I worked for that other person. I reported to that other person. And ironically, later in life, after a couple of evolutions, we became great friends. It was just, I think, an impulsive statement at the wrong time with the wrong perception of everything that was occurring. And I think one's perception sometimes can get out of whack because of ego.
The downfalls of youth, I guess.
I'm sorry?
The downfalls of youth, I guess. Thinking you're on top of the world.
No,
but,
that's true.
Yeah. I mean, speaking of students and youth in general, you said something that really, I guess, spoke to me, and I think would speak to others, is that life is too short to join companies that do not align with your values. Could you better expand upon this idea, and how students that may also not have a usual trajectory can seek out these companies, or, in a world and industry where business ethics and morals is becoming more of a discussion, what does this mean?
That's a very, very good point. One of the wonderful things that happened in my life was encountering Irwin Jacobs, who had started the predecessor to Qualcomm. And what was always important at every company he founded, the predecessor and Qualcomm itself, was that one never worried about ethics because everything was above reproach. One always was excited by challenges that if you succeeded at would actually do something good for humanity. And by the way, because it would do something good for humanity, it would probably make money also. But it wasn't the other way around. It wasn't, here's something that's going to make money, let's go do it. And part of it was the culture of just going out and hiring the best and the brightest people, giving them the freedom to explore and to invent and innovate. And so I think what's really important is understanding, if you're going to join a company, what is its vision? Is that vision aligned with what you want out of life? Is it doing good things for people, for humanity? Is it aligned with what you think you want to do with your life? The second thing is, in addition to vision, what's the mission? Is the mission something significant, or is the mission just about making money? And then the third is, what are the cultural values? Is it a company that's about inclusion? Is diversity? Is it about a company that wants to serve humanity? And so I think that probing mission, vision, and cultural values is very important. And then look at the track record. How many people have voluntarily left that company? I mean, the attrition rate at companies that Irwin had, the attrition rate at ViaSat, these almost non-existent attrition rates. People don't leave. I mean, there's a reason that I'm at ViaSat for 16 years, and the 3 founders are still there after 30 years. And so look at the track records of the people in companies. Have they been there a long time, or is there a lot of turnover? Things of that nature. But life is short. I mean, the 16 years I've been at ViaSat have gone by like a flash. And yet they've been some of the most rewarding years of my life. And I think, as I said in an interview I had when I became distinguished alumnus a couple of years ago, I said that I still think, even at my age, that my greatest contribution may not have happened yet. And I'm hoping over the next couple of years it will happen at ViaSat, which is making a significant inroad in connecting the unconnected and transforming their lives through some of these applications that are now enabled by connectivity.
And I think a lot of your experience with these different industries has really, I think, shaped a lot of your values because of what these companies and companies you started on your own valued. So how do you think working with these companies, starting your own, your whole history has shaped your understanding on not only connectivity as a human right, but just like human rights in general and your interest in helping other people in underprivileged areas?
Well, one of the reasons I started the Internet Music Company, back in 1999, was because I felt that the Internet was a new medium that would actually globalize performance and would do one other thing. It would disintermediate the incumbent structures that in some cases became obstacles to the performers. And that was in 1999. And now, of course, everyone's talking about disintermediation and globalization. It was very clear that that was going to happen, and that was what the Internet was going to do. So already we knew that connectivity was going to be important. And one of the reasons my Internet Music Company failed was because everyone in the world did not have high-speed modems. And so even though we were providing very high-quality audio and video, in fact, we did the first audio-video opera in the history of the Internet from St. Petersburg. It was a 1 or 2 inch square thing on your PC, but people didn't have broadband connectivity. And so there are things that couldn't happen that can transform lives, not just from an entertainment value, but from telehealth, online education, that can't happen without good connectivity. So I became aware of all of these other sustainable development goals that could be implemented once connectivity was enabled. Even gender equality. One of the things we're doing when we connect villages is we're creating new local entrepreneurs. And many of those entrepreneurs are female because they currently aren't employed in those communities. So I think lots of things will occur because of connectivity that really are other human rights.
And you mentioned telehealth and you mentioned telemedicine before. Is that a part of the future? Are they joined together, or are they more like 2 separate adventures that are happening?
Well, telehealth, of course, requires good connectivity. I mean, you can't have a reliable audio-video session with a healthcare professional without it. And I think the COVID pandemic has shown the value of telehealth, and I think we're all witnessing increased use of telehealth in our own engagements with healthcare professionals. What we're interested in, especially with Ram Fish's company, 19 Labs, is creating what we call enhanced telehealth, which is that a healthcare professional who is remote from the patient will not only be able to interact with the patient in an audio-video way, but will actually have all of the vital signs and diagnostics in advance or during the session that one would get in a doctor's office. And that kind of enhanced telehealth can radically change outcomes. And so I think that we're going to see increasing use of telehealth because it was accelerated by the pandemic. I don't think it's going to change. I think that will continue. Even if the pandemic declines, I think we're still going to see increased telehealth use because it's so convenient. And I think the same is true for online education. I'm not sure we're going to go back to 100% in classroom learning. And if we don't, then we need good connectivity to sustain the kind of interactions that we all want for good education.
During this pivotal moment, I think you're bringing up good reminders of, I guess, the accessibility that this pandemic and everything that's been happening around us has created. And actually, we actually have a question from Elizabeth over here, and she wanted to ask you something about what you were saying before regarding privilege in underprivileged areas.
Yeah. Hi, I'm Elizabeth Chored. I'm a junior marketing major at Case, and I was just wondering, like in the instances in which you brought affordable connectivity to like these low socioeconomic communities that haven't, previously had it, have you seen that like, the people in these communities need to learn like how to use the internet in a way that can, really improve their lives, especially, because like they haven't had it before, like they don't have like, the same internet literacy that maybe like you or I have. And then like, are there services that you provide to teach people these things, or like, do you see benefits in these services?
Yeah, very, very good question. We actually have seen that there are some issues with digital literacy, but one of the reasons we have local entrepreneurs is we train them to train the people in the local community. But most people who already have cell phones know how to do very basic things. They know how to do FaceTime, but there are some sophisticated things that they have to learn. So I think we are doing training of local community entrepreneurs to do some of that. So digital literacy is an issue, but I think too much has been made of that. If you hear some talks at the UN, the content people, in other words, the people who have a vested interest in producing content, say we don't have the right educational content, or we don't have the right content. And then others who want to teach say we haven't taught the right digital literacy, and that's also an obstacle for adoption. I think, in fact, people learn quite quickly how to do what's important to them if they have connectivity. And we shouldn't hold back doing the connectivity because some of those other elements don't exist. It will be helpful for adoption to have those other elements, but I don't think it's critical. As a matter of fact, a dear friend of mine, who some of you may know, Nicholas Negroponte from MIT Media Lab, dropped a bunch of connected devices, I think in Ethiopia, and he said within 6 months, without any training, the kids were already hacking the system. So let's not underestimate the ability of young people to do things once they're connected.
I'm still young, and I think I can't do what they probably did. So Elizabeth, that was a great question, and a wonderful point to actually also pivot off of. You were talking about in these areas as well, starting entrepreneurial experiences, especially for women. Why do you think ViaSat really wanted to take that initiative on? You're talking about connectivity and you are a connection service. What difference do you think that makes in not only where they're living, but also just in the broader span of what ViaSat wants to do?
Well, ViaSat's a profit-making business. So we're always looking for opportunities where there's an intersection of doing good and making money. And it occurred to us that the cellular industry had done a fairly good job in connecting people, who were in socioeconomic classes A, B, and C, especially in developing countries. You look at sub-Saharan Africa, and I think connectivity is 19%. So there's a long way to go in sub-Saharan Africa. So when we took a look at that, we realized that we would plateau at some point if we just focused in developing countries in socioeconomic classes A and B and C. And so the question is, what can you do to expand the business if you have innovative technologies? And so we just decided to see where there were what we call blue oceans. And the blue oceans were the people who were not connected. And when we realized that it was mostly affordability, although Elizabeth is correct, there are digital literacy and content issues, we decided to actually make that a focus of our future business.
And with that, how in your position do you balance the responsibilities of being a corporation, being a business, but also the public service element, the connecting with United Nations, speaking about this human rights issue? How do you balance that in your specific position?
Well, as I say, you join companies that are aligned to your values, and social responsibility has always been an important value at ViaSat, as well as almost every company that was a spin out of Irwin Jacobs' original company. And so I think that those companies that do good things, are socially responsible, can make money and put some of that money back into their social responsibility. So I think it's an important value, and I think it's a value that people should cherish when they're deciding among companies to join.
And the UN obviously partnered with you because they see this value and they see this morality that this company possesses. How has the connection with the UN expanded your reach to other parts of the world, or has just given you more access to elements that you may not have been able to access previously?
I think the United Nations has given us very good access. During the opening of the UN this year, I was able to give 2 or 3 talks, and members of ViaSat also gave several talks. And the audience, of course, were presidents of countries, ministers of economics, finance, communications, healthcare, education. And through those connections, even though they were on Zoom this year, where in the past they've been in person, we have made considerable inroads around the world in a number of countries that are strategically important to us and also to U.S. national security.
Has it just been while you've been in your position the past 16 years, or was this always a goal of ViaSat to create this connection in order to then connect other people, becoming relevant to other international organizations?
I think it was less so until we made a technological breakthrough that made us realize that we could finally achieve the affordability criterion necessary for mass adoption. So that's only been within the last 8 or 9 years. And it was 3 years ago that we made the commitment to invest $3 billion to actually connect all parts of the world. And once we made that commitment, we decided that we really needed to understand how things were going to progress globally. And that's quite a learning experience when you're US-centric, to suddenly realize that you have potential business in 195 countries. And that's going to be quite a challenge for us to do that, but it's going to be an exciting one.
Especially as you guys continue to grow, obviously. But what about the next 16 years? Mike, let's say you don't retire, you just stay for the next 16 years at ViaSat. What's next? Everyone's connected, everyone has internet access. What is the next step? Where do we go from there?
Well, the crystal ball in 16 years is difficult. I suspect that there will be increasing demand and use of the internet. So we're going to have to give people, for the same amount of money, more and more access to connectivity, just like it's been happening over the last few years. But there may be entire new industries that get created. I mean, none of us could predict in 2000 Facebook, right? And I think what will happen is the connectivity will engender new businesses and new industries. And that in itself will be something we're going to have to follow and participate in if we're going to continue to grow.
Do you think?
But I will say the telehealth aspect, something that you and I talked about is how do you look for opportunities to be an entrepreneur in? And I think what I said to you was one thing you can do is follow the money. If you take a look at the global GDP, which is about $90 trillion, and ask yourself, what are the three largest elements that comprise that $90 trillion? Well, the two largest are food production and healthcare. They're about $9 trillion each. The third is education, which is about $5 trillion. Advertising is only $500 billion globally. Telecommunications and ICT is about $1.5 trillion. The military is $2 trillion. So the globe right now is dominated by three industries, education, healthcare, and food production. And those are the areas where I would look for innovation and intersect that with connectivity. And I think that intersection will lead you to a whole series of new innovations, new businesses, new opportunities that will not only be quite exciting and challenging, but fundable because they're so important to humanity.
Do you think, in your opinion, COVID has helped or hindered your company in kind of realizing this intersection and making it a possibility? COVID has been not great for everyone, but as a communications company that's working with this kind of technology, what has it done for you?
Well, let me start with the negative. The negative is that one of our fastest growing businesses was airline connectivity. If you have flown JetBlue or United or American, and you had a good connectivity experience, was likely a ViaSat connection. So COVID, of course, has curtailed passengers on planes. And so we've had a hit to that particular business because of COVID. On the other hand, the demand for connectivity in our residential business, in our enterprise businesses, and in serving education and healthcare needs has increased considerably during COVID. And I think what COVID has done is it has taken a couple of hypotheses and just proven them and acted as a catalyst. And those hypotheses are that telehealth will have a major role in healthcare. There's no question that COVID has been a catalyst to that. And I think that will continue. Another hypothesis is that online education, because of connectivity, was going to be an important element in the future. That's why there's a Khan Academy and a learning equality and all of these companies that are developing online MOOCs and things of that nature. But COVID has been a fantastic catalyst. And so I think in those two areas, it has been a catalyst. In food production, it may be a catalyst for the distribution needs. We now need more distribution than we did in the past because people aren't coming to where the food is going to where the people are. Just as somebody pointed out that with the new vaccine from Pfizer, we're going to have the distribution challenge of distributing things at very low temperatures. So I think in the food production area and some of these areas, there will be distribution and logistics challenges that have to be addressed that have been catalyzed by COVID. So I think that COVID has served as a fantastic catalyst in some very important areas, and those areas will continue to grow in the future and open up opportunities for employment and for innovation.
As you were saying, follow the money. That creates a great business opportunity. So do you have any advice for maybe some entrepreneurs watching now, later, or in general that, are thinking of getting involved in this? You've obviously worked with cruise students before and helped them with their careers. And so I guess other than ego and some of the failures you were talking about, what do you think you need to keep in mind when following this trail of money and businesses and experience?
Well, I think if you're going to be an entrepreneur, you obviously have to be competent. That goes without saying in your chosen field. But then the question is, what are the attributes you really need to be an entrepreneur beyond competence? Because not everybody either is cut out to be an entrepreneur, nor should they be an entrepreneur. I mean, that's not the end all of a career. But I think the attributes that are so important are you have to have a passion for what you're doing. And I would go even further. That passion has to almost be an obsession, because the amount of time you will spend in becoming an entrepreneur, especially if you start a company or you're a co-founder or an early employee, is unbelievable. And it's not too different, Emma, from what you know in performing arts, or I know from my wife, who's a concert pianist. You have to be obsessed if you're going to succeed. So being obsessed and having a passion for what you're doing is critical. And then the other is that you have to be willing to take risk. You have to be willing to fail. Otherwise, you're not going to create something that has enough of a threshold to the status quo. It's not going to be innovative enough or challenging enough. And you have to be willing to take that risk, and that risk implies there could be failure. And so you have to be someone who is willing to take risk or failure. I gave some talks in Mexico to an MBA graduating class and in Colombia to the government a few years ago on what it would take those countries to actually create the equivalent of a Silicon Valley. And when I mentioned risk-taking, they both came back and said, but risk-taking and failure is not, and acceptance of failure is not part of our culture. And if it's not part of your culture, I think it becomes an obstacle to actually deploying entrepreneurship. So I think to the audience, for future entrepreneurs, you know, if you want to be an entrepreneur, make sure you're obsessed with something that has value and that can help transform lives and humanity. Be willing to take risks and risk of failure. And if you have those attributes and you have great competence, join companies that have those attributes and make great contributions.
To say a lot of times, especially I think in the higher education sphere, you know, taking risks, failing, not something you're necessarily taught to do or encouraged to do. So it's refreshing to hear. But you told us about these two risks you took, and they didn't necessarily work out, one maybe because of ego and the other one just because it didn't work. So do you have any specific ideas in mind of a risk you took and you're very grateful you took it?
In retrospect, I think I feel positive about all the risks I took because they led to modifications to my trajectory. And that's what's exciting about life, is that there are opportunities at many, many points, and you just have to be open to accepting them. And sometimes they happen because of failure. It was interesting, when my internet music company failed, it was interesting to see where the first calls came from people who wanted to make sure I was okay, because that was probably the largest failure of my life. And it's not easy when people have lost tens upon tens of millions of dollars that they've invested in a company because of you, and it failed. It's not just the failure of the company, it's the failure of the relationships that you formed and the trust people put in you. But I was amused that the first calls came in from my colleagues in Japan, with whom I had formed relationships with over 5 or 10 years, and wanted to make sure I was okay. And they said they were going to send money if I needed money, or they were going to give me a job if I needed a job. But you can actually learn quite a bit with those failures and use that as an opportunity not only to improve, but to move on to maybe a slightly altered trajectory. And that's exciting.
Also, no regrets, right?
No regrets. I have regrets that I lost a lot of money and other people's money in that venture, but that happens.
It happens. I actually want to give it to Elizabeth one more time, who has another question for you.
Yeah, so you mentioned earlier expecting that everyone would adopt smartphones like way earlier than we actually did. So is there a certain technology that you're looking at today that you think like people will be adopting soon, or is there one that like you're surprised that people haven't already adopted en masse?
I really have not thought much about that. As I say, I think the trends of what has been started already will continue. I haven't seen what I would call disruptive new applications that I think will be enabled by that connectivity yet. Is the transition from linear television to over-the-top disruptive? It's disruptive to the industry, but I don't think it's transformational in the way people, in people's lives. We're looking at all of these areas. We're looking at the one I think that's intriguing is the Internet of Things for food production. I think maybe the use of drones for distribution. It goes back to these trends that I've discussed, not only from following the money, but inevitable trends. There is one that I'm trying to think of, which has to do with the youth explosion in Africa. I don't know how many people have actually looked at this, but I was actually fortunate enough to be at a lunch about a year ago with the brother of the president of Kenya. And he mentioned to me that the median age in Africa is 19. The median age in the United States, I think, is 38. So there's an enormous youth explosion going on in Africa, more than in the developed countries. And in fact, the third largest country in the world in population in 2050 will be Nigeria. It's going to pass the United States in population. So if you know that there's going to be an inevitable trend of a youth explosion over the next 20 years, 20, 30 years, what are all of the things that are going to be necessary to make that successful, that transformation successful? And there's so many I can think of. And so that's an area of how to ensure that this youth explosion are going to have meaningful lives and not be clobbered with unemployment or education that doesn't align with job demand, or going to be disappointed because they can no longer leave rural areas and congest urban areas, et cetera, et cetera. I think how we're going to solve those problems politically, economically, socially, and technologically, I think are going to be very important. There are a couple of companies that are talking about how to address this rural-urban migration because of youth explosion that's occurring and keeping people in rural areas through the use of technologies and improving their lives in rural areas. So I think there are some very large challenges ahead of us where technology is intersecting with those challenges.
Again, another insightful question from Elizabeth. And Mr. Lubin, again, it is such a pleasure just for you to be here today and talk to us. So thank you so much. I'm going to throw this back to Doug just to wrap us all up, but I can't tell you how great this was.
Oh, thanks very much.
Thank you both, Emma and Mike, for taking the time today. We always appreciate hearing from talented speakers and experienced professionals. And we always enjoy when our students can facilitate these conversations and learn a little bit about career journeys and your experience in sectors. And once again, thank you, Mike, and thank you, Emma, for taking the time today.
Thank everyone for inviting me. It was a pleasure.